In the summer of 2008, deep in the mountains of Afghanistan, 381 Navy SEALs found themselves trapped in a canyon with no way out. Taliban forces surrounded them from every direction. Their radios were dead. Their ammunition was running low, and rescue seemed impossible. But sometimes when everything looks hopeless, a single person can change the course of history. Sometimes that person comes from where you least expect it. And sometimes they have to break every rule in the book to do what's right. This is the true story of Captain Sarah Martinez, an A-10 Thunderbolt pilot who was told to stand down, who was ordered to follow protocol, and who chose to listen to something else entirely. Her actions that day would save 381 lives, destroy her military career, and prove that courage doesn't always wear the uniform you expect. What happened in those Afghan mountains wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a testament to what one person can do when they refuse to accept that some people are expendable, when they decide that rules matter less than lives, when they choose to act, even when everyone else chooses to wait. This is her story. This is their story. This is the story that the military tried to bury, that the media never fully told, and that the families of those 381 SEALs will never forget. The radio crackled to life at 0347 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of Bagram Air Base like a knife through paper. Captain Sarah Martinez had been awake for 23 hours straight, her eyes burning from staring at intelligence reports and weather patterns. She should have been asleep, but something about the night felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes experienced pilots check their equipment one more time. All available units, we have a code red situation in the Khyber province. Multiple teams need immediate extraction. This is not a drill. Sarah's blood went cold. She knew what units were operating in Khyber province. Her brother Mike was somewhere in those mountains with SEAL Team 6. The thought hit her like a physical blow, and she was moving before her conscious mind caught up with her body. The briefing room at Bagram was chaos when she arrived. Officers shouted over each other. Maps covered every available surface, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Colonel James Hartwell stood at the center of it all, his face grim as he pointed to a red circle on the tactical display. "Here's what we know," Hartwell began, his voice cutting through the noise. Operation Mountain Thunder was supposed to be a routine sweep and clear mission. 3 SEAL teams, 127 personnel total, went in to clear out a Taliban stronghold in the Karangal Valley. What they found wasn't a stronghold. It was a trap. The room fell silent. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Intelligence was wrong. Dead wrong. Instead of 30 Taliban fighters, our boys walked into a coordinated ambush involving over 400 enemy combatants. They're pinned down in a canyon with limited ammunition, no clear exit strategy, and enemy reinforcements arriving by the hour. A major near the back of the room raised his hand. "Sir, what about air support?" "That's the problem," Hartwell replied, his jaw tight. "The weather's turned. We've got a massive storm system moving in from the west. Visibility is near zero, winds are gusting up to 60 miles per hour, and the ceiling is dropping fast. Command has grounded all rotary aircraft until further notice." Sarah's heart sank. No helicopters meant no extraction. In weather like this, even the most experienced pilots wouldn't risk it. The margins for error were too small, and the consequences too deadly. "What about fixed-wing support?" asked Captain Torres, one of Sarah's squadron mates. "F-16s can't provide close air support in this terrain," Hartwell explained. "The mountains create wind shear that makes precision strikes impossible. And, frankly, our boys are too close to civilian populations for heavy ordnance anyway." That's when Sarah realized what she was thinking. The A-10 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Warthog, was built for exactly this kind of mission. Low and slow, designed to provide close air support in hostile conditions. Its titanium bathtub could take hits that would down any other aircraft, and its Gu-8 cannon could deliver precision fire support like nothing else in the Air Force arsenal. But flying in this weather would be suicide. Or close to it. "Sir," Sarah heard herself saying, "what about A-10 support?" The room turned to look at her. Hartwell's expression was unreadable. "Captain Martinez, in case you haven't been listening, we have zero visibility conditions out there. Flying anything in this weather is out of the question." "The A-10 can handle weather that would ground other aircraft," Sarah pressed. "And the SEAL teams need close air support. If they're trapped in a canyon, the Warthog is the only platform that can get low enough to provide effective cover." The answer is no, Captain. I won't risk additional lives on what amounts to a suicide mission. But Sarah couldn't let it go. Not when she knew her brother was down there. Not when 381 of America's most elite warriors were trapped and running out of time. The meeting broke up with no clear resolution. Command was working diplomatic channels to see if Pakistani forces could assist from across the border. Intelligence was trying to get better satellite imagery through the cloud cover. Search and rescue teams were on standby, waiting for the weather to clear. All of it would take time. Time the SEAL teams didn't have. Sarah made her way to the flight line, her mind racing. The A-10s sat in their hangars like sleeping giants, their angular frames and massive cannons giving them an almost prehistoric appearance. She'd been flying Warthogs for 6 years, ever since graduating from the Air Force Academy. She knew every rivet, every system, every quirk of the aircraft. More importantly, she knew what it could do. The A-10 was built around its gun, a 7-barrel Gu-8 Avenger cannon that fired armor-piercing rounds at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. The titanium armor surrounding the cockpit could withstand direct hits from 23mm cannon fire. The aircraft could fly with one engine, half a wing, and most of its control surfaces shot away and still bring the pilot home. If any aircraft could handle the weather conditions over Khyber province, it was the Warthog. Sarah found herself standing in front of her assigned aircraft, tail number 80-0248. She named it Desert Angel, after her first deployment to Iraq, where she'd flown cover for Army units pushing toward Baghdad. The aircraft had brought her through 127 combat missions without a scratch. But this would be different. This would be flying into the worst weather conditions she'd ever seen, over some of the most hostile terrain in Afghanistan, to save men who might already be dead. Her maintenance chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, appeared beside her. "Can't sleep either, Captain." "Something like that," Sarah replied. "How's the bird?" "Ready to fly, ma'am. Just finished the pre-flight inspection. All systems green." Rodriguez paused, studying her face. "You're thinking about going out there, aren't you?" Sarah looked at him sharply. Rodriguez had been maintaining aircraft for 15 years. He had an uncanny ability to read pilots' intentions. "It's just a thought," she said carefully. "Ma'am, with all due respect, thinking about it and doing it are two different things. What's out there at night would be challenging in daylight with perfect weather. In these conditions, it's borderline impossible." "Borderline isn't impossible," Sarah said quietly. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Your brother's out there, isn't he?" Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Ma'am, I've got 2 sons in the Army. One's deployed to Iraq right now. If someone told me he was trapped somewhere and nobody was coming to help..." Rodriguez shook his head. "Well, let's just say I understand the feeling." The colonel was clear. "No flights until the weather clears." "Yes, ma'am." And the colonel's probably right from a command perspective. But from a human perspective, Rodriguez trailed off. "If you were to take Desert Angel up for a routine maintenance flight to check the new navigation system, well, that wouldn't technically be a combat mission, would it?" Sarah stared at him. "Sergeant, you're suggesting I disobey direct orders." "No, ma'am. I'm suggesting you follow your conscience. There's a difference." Back in her quarters, Sarah sat on the edge of her bunk and stared at the tactical radio on her desk. She'd managed to patch into the emergency frequency the SEAL teams were using, though the signal was weak and filled with static. What she heard made her blood run cold. "Taking heavy casualties, ammunition running low, request immediate extraction. Negative on extraction, weather's too bad for rotary wing. How long can you hold position?" "Maybe 6 hours if we're lucky. Enemies bringing up mortars." 6 hours. In 6 hours, 381 Navy SEALs would be overrun and killed. And everyone knew it. Sarah looked at her flight suit hanging on the wall. Next to it hung a framed photo of her and Mike at her commissioning ceremony, both of them grinning like idiots. Mike had been so proud when she got her wings. "My little sister's going to be flying combat missions," he told everyone at the party. "She's going to save lives." Now, she had the chance to save his. But it would mean ending her career. Disobeying direct orders in a combat zone was court-martial material. She'd lose her wings, probably serve time in military prison, and definitely never fly again. On the other hand, 381 men would die if she did nothing. The choice, when she really thought about it, wasn't much of a choice at all. Sarah stood up and began getting dressed. She pulled on her flight suit with methodical precision, checking each pocket, each piece of equipment. She strapped on her survival vest, her helmet, her oxygen mask. Every movement was automatic, drilled into her through thousands of hours of training. As she walked toward the door, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked like any other Air Force pilot preparing for a mission. But she knew this might be the last time she wore the uniform. The flight line was eerily quiet at 0630 hours. Most of the base was still asleep, and the storm had driven even the maintenance crews indoors. Sarah made her way to Desert Angel's hangar, her footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn darkness. Rodriguez was waiting for her, along with her weapons loader, Airman First Class Johnson. Both men were fully dressed and ready for operations. "Figured you might need some help with that maintenance flight," Rodriguez said with a slight smile. "Sergeant, if you help me, you're risking your career too." "Ma'am, I've got 18 years in. I can handle whatever comes next." Johnson here volunteered when I told him what we were doing. The young airman stepped forward. "Captain, my older brother's a ranger. If it was him out there," he shrugged. "Some things are worth a risk." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. These men were willing to sacrifice their careers to help her save lives. It was both humbling and terrifying. "All right then," she said. "Let's get this bird ready to fly." The pre-flight inspection took 45 minutes in the driving rain. Sarah methodically checked every surface, every panel, every system on Desert Angel while Rodriguez and Johnson loaded ammunition into the GAU-8 cannon. The 30mm armor-piercing rounds felt heavier than usual as they fed them into the drum, each one a potential lifesaver for the men trapped in the mountains. The weather was getting worse by the hour. Wind gusts rocked the hangar doors, and the rain had turned into a mixture of sleet and snow. The storm system was massive, stretching across 3 provinces and showing no signs of weakening. Satellite imagery showed cloud cover extending from ground level to 30,000 feet, with severe turbulence reported at all altitudes. It was exactly the kind of weather that killed pilots. Sarah climbed into the cockpit at 0715 hours, her hands moving through the startup checklist with practiced efficiency. The A-10's engines spooled up with their characteristic high-pitched whine, sending vibrations through the airframe that she felt in her bones. Every gauge, every light, every system showed green. Desert Angel was ready for whatever lay ahead. "Tower, this is Hog 1-1 requesting permission for maintenance flight," Sarah radioed. There was a pause. Then, "Hog 1-1, Tower. Be advised we have severe weather conditions throughout the area. Are you sure about this maintenance requirement?" "Roger, Tower. Testing new navigation equipment requires actual flight conditions." Another pause. Sarah knew the tower controller was probably checking with his supervisor. Maintenance flights during severe weather were unusual, but not unheard of. And technically, she wasn't lying about testing equipment. "Hog 1-1, you're cleared for takeoff. Recommend you stay within the traffic pattern and return immediately if conditions worsen." "Copy, Tower." Hog 1-1 rolling. Sarah released the brakes and pushed the throttles forward. Desert Angel lurched into motion, its twin turbofan engines providing thrust as the aircraft gained speed down the rain-slicked runway. At 135 knots, she pulled back on the stick and felt a familiar sensation of liftoff. Immediately, the aircraft was buffeted by wind shear that would have torn a lesser plane apart. The A-10 bucked and rolled, its heavy airframe fighting against the turbulent air. Sarah's hands flew across the controls, making constant adjustments to keep the aircraft level. Rain hammered against the canopy so hard she couldn't see more than a few hundred meters in any direction. This was insane. Every instinct she developed as a pilot screamed at her to turn around, to land immediately, to wait for better conditions. Flying in weather like this violated every safety protocol in the Air Force manual. But then the radio crackled to life with another transmission from the trapped SEALs, and her resolve hardened. Under heavy mortar fire, casualties mounting. How much longer until extraction? Still no word from command. Weather's got everything grounded. We're not going to last much longer. Sarah banked sharply to the east, toward the Kiener province. She climbed to 8,000 feet, trying to get above the worst of the turbulence, but found only thicker clouds and stronger winds. Ice began forming on the leading edges of her wings, adding weight and reducing lift. The aircraft's de-icing system kicked in automatically, heating the wing surfaces to prevent a catastrophic buildup. Navigation was nearly impossible. The storm was interfering with GPS signals, and The mountains were blocking radio navigation beacons. Sarah was flying largely by dead reckoning, using her compass and airspeed to estimate her position. Every few minutes, she caught glimpses of the ground through breaks in the clouds, trying to match the terrain below with her map. 45 minutes after takeoff, she reached the general area where the SEAL teams were reported to be trapped. The Korangal Valley stretched out below her, invisible beneath a thick layer of clouds. She knew the teams were somewhere in that maze of ridges and canyons, but finding them would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. That's when she heard the call she'd been waiting for. Any aircraft, any aircraft. This is Bravo 27. We are in contact with heavy enemy forces and need immediate air support. Does anyone copy? Sarah keyed her microphone immediately. Bravo 27, this is Hog 11. I copy your transmission. What's your position? The relief in the SEAL's voice was obvious, even through the static. Hog 11, thank God. We're in a box canyon approximately 2 clicks north of Hill 2540. Enemy positions are on the ridge lines above us, and we're taking fire from multiple directions. Sarah checked her map. Hill 2540 was a prominent peak that she should be able to identify even in these conditions. She banked toward the north, descending through the cloud layer. At 6,000 feet, she broke through the bottom of the clouds and found herself in a gray twilight world of driving rain and swirling mist. The mountains rose around her like ancient monuments, their peaks disappearing into the clouds above. The terrain was even more treacherous than she'd imagined, with narrow valleys and knife-edge ridges that could tear an aircraft apart if a pilot made even a small mistake. Bravo 27, I'm in the area, but I need you to mark your position. Do you have any signaling devices? Roger, Hog. Popping smoke now. Sarah peered through the rain, scanning the valleys below. There, a thin tendril of orange smoke rising from a narrow canyon about 3 kilometers ahead. She could see muzzle flashes along the ridgelines on both sides of the canyon, where Taliban fighters were pouring fire down on the trapped Americans. The tactical situation was immediately clear. The SEAL teams had been forced into a dead-end canyon with steep walls on 3 sides. Enemy forces held the high ground and had clear fields of fire into the canyon floor. It was a killing field, and the Americans were running out of places to hide. Bravo 27, I have eyes on your position. I counted approximately 40 to 50 enemy positions along the ridgelines. Be advised, danger close. Hog 11, we understand danger close. Whatever you can do, we need it now. We're almost out of ammunition. Sarah studied the tactical situation below. The enemy positions were dug in along the ridgelines, taking advantage of rocky outcroppings and cave mouths that provided excellent cover. A standard attack run would expose her aircraft to concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple directions. In these weather conditions, with limited visibility and treacherous winds, it would be extremely dangerous. But the SEALs were out of options. Bravo 27, I'm going to make an attack run from the south. Keep your heads down. Sarah banked the A-10 into a steep diving turn, lining up on the eastern ridgeline, where she'd seen the heaviest concentration of muzzle flashes. The aircraft shuddered as it picked up speed, rain streaming across the canopy and reducing visibility to nearly zero. She could barely make out the rocky ridge ahead, but she could see the orange sparks of enemy gunfire. At 4,000 feet, she squeezed the trigger on the GU-8 cannon. The sound was indescribable. The massive cannon unleashed a stream of 30mm armor-piercing rounds at a rate of 65 rounds per second, each one capable of punching through tank armor. The entire aircraft shook from the recoil, and the muzzle flash lit up the storm clouds like lightning. The depleted uranium rounds struck the rocky ridgeline in a line of explosive impacts, sending up geysers of stone and dirt. Enemy fire from that section of ridge ceased immediately. Hog 11, that's a direct hit, came the excited voice from below. You just cleared out at least 20 positions. But Sarah's celebration was short-lived. As she pulled up from the attack run, red warning lights began flashing in her cockpit. The aircraft had taken multiple hits from small arms fire, and one of her engines was running hot. Oil pressure was dropping rapidly. Not good, she muttered, checking her engine instruments. The number 2 engine was definitely damaged, probably from rifle fire that had penetrated the engine compartment. She shut it down and feathered the propeller, reducing power to the remaining engine. The A-10 was designed to fly with one engine, but in these conditions, with a full load of ammunition and limited visibility, it would be challenging. She'd lost significant power and maneuverability, making her an easier target for enemy gunners. Bravo 2-7, I've taken some damage, but I'm still in the fight. Give me another target. Hog 1-1, we got heavy machine gun positions on the western ridge. Grid 41 SQR 12345 67890. They're keeping us pinned down in the southern portion of the canyon. Sarah banked toward the western ridge, fighting to keep the damaged aircraft under control. The single engine was struggling to maintain altitude, and she could feel the aircraft wanting to roll to the right due to the asymmetric thrust. Ice was building up on her wings again, adding weight and reducing lift even further. Through the driving rain, she could see the muzzle flashes from the machine gun positions. They were well concealed among the rocks, but the continuous fire gave away their positions. She lined up for another attack run, this time approaching from the west to minimize her exposure to other enemy positions. The second attack run was even more difficult than the first. With only one engine, she had to approach at a shallower angle, which kept her in the enemy's line of fire longer. Bullets sparked off her armored cockpit as she closed the distance, the titanium bathtub protecting her from the worst of it. She opened fire at 3,500 feet, walking the cannon fire across the ridge in a devastating display of firepower. The 30mm rounds tore through rock and vegetation, silencing the machine gun positions in a matter of seconds. But as she pulled up from the attack, she felt the aircraft shudder violently. More warning lights flashed on her instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure was dropping rapidly, and she could feel the flight controls becoming sluggish. A quick glance at her damage assessment panel showed hits to the hydraulic lines and possibly the flight control surfaces. The A-10 was famous for its ability to absorb damage and keep flying, but there were limits to what any aircraft could take. Sarah was rapidly approaching those limits. Hog 1-1, beautiful work, called the SEAL on the radio. You've suppressed most of the enemy fire. We're going to try to move to a more defensible position. Sarah looked down at the canyon floor and could see tiny figures moving among the rocks. The SEALs were taking advantage of the lull in enemy fire to reposition themselves and tend to their wounded. But she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. More Taliban fighters would arrive soon, and she couldn't stay airborne much longer with her damaged aircraft. Bravo 2-7, I need to know how many personnel you have and what your extraction options are. My aircraft is damaged, and I won't be able to provide much more support. Hog 1-1, we have 381 personnel, including wounded. Extraction by helicopter is impossible due to weather conditions and the confined space of this canyon. We need the landing zone cleared of enemy forces before any rescue attempt can be made. 381 personnel. Sarah felt the weight of that number settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. Nearly 400 of America's finest warriors trapped and running out of time. And she was their only hope for survival. Looking at her fuel gauge, she calculated that she had maybe 30 minutes of flying time remaining. 30 minutes to clear out enough enemy positions to allow for a successful extraction. In a damaged aircraft, in the worst weather she'd ever flown in, against an enemy that had already proven they could hit her. The odds were impossibly long. But Sarah Martinez had never been one to back down from impossible odds. She banked the crippled A-10 around for another attack run, her jaw set with determination. The men below were counting on her, and she wasn't going to let them down. Not today. Not ever. Sarah's third attack run nearly killed her. As she descended through the swirling clouds toward the northern ridge, where Taliban reinforcements had just arrived with rocket-propelled grenades, the damaged A-10 began to fall apart around her. The hydraulic failure had worsened, making the aircraft respond like a wounded animal. Every control input required tremendous effort, and the aircraft wanted to roll uncontrollably to the right. But worse than the mechanical problems was what she saw on the ground. The Taliban had brought up a truck-mounted anti-aircraft gun, a Soviet-era Zu-23 that could put 2,000 rounds per minute into the air. As Sarah committed to her attack run, the twin 23mm cannons opened fire, filling the sky with streams of tracers that looked like deadly fireworks in the gray morning light. Sarah jinked left and right, trying to throw off the gunner's aim, But with only one engine and damaged flight controls, the A-10's maneuverability was severely limited. She could feel bullets impacting the aircraft, each hit transmitting through the airframe like a hammer blow. One round punched through the canopy just inches from her head, spiderwebbing the bulletproof glass. She squeezed the trigger on the Gu-8, sending a stream of 30mm rounds into the anti-aircraft position. The depleted uranium projectiles tore through the truck's armor like tissue paper, turning the vehicle and its crew into a fireball that lit up the entire valley. The explosion was so massive that it started an avalanche on the opposite ridge, tons of rock and snow cascading down the mountainside. But the victory came at a cost. As Sarah pulled up from the attack run, the aircraft shuddered violently and began losing altitude. The number 1 engine was now running roughly, damaged by debris from the explosion. Oil pressure was dropping on both engines, and she could see fuel leaking from holes in the wings. Hog 1-1. That was incredible, came the excited voice from the canyon below. You just took out their heavy weapons position. But are you okay up there? Sarah checked her instruments with growing alarm. Fuel was down to 15 minutes. Both engines were damaged and running rough. Hydraulic pressure was near zero, meaning she was controlling the aircraft through pure muscle power and backup systems. Most critically, her altitude was decreasing steadily, and she wasn't sure she had enough power to climb back above the mountain peaks. Bravo 2-7, I'm still in the fight, she radioed back, though privately she wondered if that was true. What's your tactical situation? Hog 1-1, your strikes have been incredibly effective. Enemy fire has decreased by about 70%, but we're still taking sporadic sniper fire from caves in the eastern wall of the canyon. And we're seeing vehicle movement on the access road. Looks like more reinforcements are coming. Sarah looked down at the canyon and could see what the SEAL was talking about. The eastern wall was honeycombed with caves and crevices, perfect hiding spots for snipers. And on the narrow dirt road that snaked up the valley, she could make out a convoy of trucks bringing fresh Taliban fighters to the battle. The SEALs had maybe an hour before they'd be completely overwhelmed. But Sarah's aircraft was dying around her. Every minute she stayed airborne brought her closer to a catastrophic failure that would kill her and eliminate the only air support the ground teams had. The smart thing would be to withdraw, to try to make it back to Bagram before the aircraft fell apart completely. The smart thing would be to abandon 381 men to their fate. Instead, she keyed her radio. Bravo 2-7, I'm going to hit that convoy before it gets to your position. After that, you need to be ready for immediate extraction. I don't know how much longer I can stay airborne. Roger, Hog. We'll be ready. Sarah banked the failing aircraft toward the convoy, which was still 2 kilometers from the canyon entrance. The trucks were moving fast along the winding mountain road, kicking up clouds of dust that mixed with the falling snow. She counted at least 8 vehicles, probably carrying 150 to 200 fighters. If they reached the canyon, the SEALs would be finished. The attack run on the convoy was unlike anything Sarah had ever attempted. The road wound through a series of switchbacks carved into the mountainside, with sheer drops on one side and vertical rock faces on the other. To hit the moving vehicles, she'd have to fly through the valley at high speed, threading the needle between mountain peaks while fighting to control a damaged aircraft. At 300 feet above the valley floor, traveling at 350 knots, Sarah opened fire on the lead vehicle. The Gu-8 cannons stitched a line of destruction along the road, turning the lead truck into a burning wreck that blocked the narrow path. The vehicles behind it were trapped, unable to advance or retreat on the confined mountain road. But as she pulled up from the attack, disaster struck. The number 1 engine finally quit completely, seized solid by the damage it had sustained. The aircraft rolled violently to the left, and Sarah fought to maintain control as her airspeed bled away. She was too low, too slow, and surrounded by mountain peaks that rose thousands of feet above her. The A-10 slammed into the ridge line with tremendous force, cartwheeling through the rocks and snow in a shower of sparks and debris. Sarah's world exploded into chaos as the aircraft disintegrated around her. The last thing she remembered was the violent snap of her ejection seat firing, blasting her clear of the wreckage just seconds before the fuel tanks exploded. When she regained consciousness, Sarah was hanging in her parachute harness, swaying gently in the mountain wind. Snow was falling steadily, and she could hear gunfire echoing through the valleys below. Her left arm was broken, hanging useless at her side, and she could taste blood in her mouth. But she was alive. Looking around, she realized she'd landed on a narrow ledge about halfway up the eastern wall of the canyon, where the seals were trapped. Below her, she could see the orange smoke that marked their position. Above her, the ledge extended into what looked like a cave system carved into the rock face. And from that cave system came the sound of voices speaking Pashto. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. She'd landed directly in the middle of one of the sniper positions that had been harassing the seals. Her parachute was draped across the rocks like a white flag, clearly visible to anyone in the canyon below. And somewhere in the caves above her, Taliban fighters were probably already moving to investigate the crash. She managed to unclip herself from the parachute harness and crawl behind a boulder, her broken arm sending waves of agony through her body. Her survival radio had been damaged in the crash, so she couldn't communicate with the SEALs below. Her sidearm, a 9mm pistol, was intact, but wouldn't be much use against multiple attackers. The voices from the cave were getting closer. Sarah pressed herself against the rock wall and tried to think. The cave system extended deep into the mountain, probably connecting to other positions throughout the eastern wall. If she could somehow get inside and work her way through the tunnels, she might be able to take out the sniper positions from behind. It would be incredibly dangerous with a broken arm and no backup, but it might be the only way to help the trapped SEALs. Plus, stay on a ledge meant certain capture or death when the Taliban fighters found her. Drawing her pistol with her good hand, Sarah began working her way up toward the cave entrance. Every step sent bolts of pain through her injured arm, and the snow was making the rocks slippery and treacherous. But she forced herself to keep moving, driven by the knowledge that 381 men were depending on her. The cave entrance was larger than it had appeared from below, wide enough for several men to move through at once. The voices inside were clearer now, and Sarah could make out at least 3 different speakers. They were discussing the crashed aircraft and wondering if the pilot had survived. They were about to find out. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped into the cave, her pistol raised and ready. The tunnel extended back into darkness, lit only by the occasional oil lamp hanging from the rock walls. The air smelled of gunpowder and unwashed bodies, and she could hear the echo of footsteps somewhere in the depths of the mountain. Moving as quietly as possible, she worked her way deeper into the cave system. The tunnels branched and twisted, carved out of the living rock over decades by Mujahideen fighters. Some passages were wide enough to drive a truck through, while others forced her to crawl on her belly. All of them showed signs of recent use, with ammunition caches, sleeping areas, and weapon positions scattered throughout. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Sarah reached a chamber where she could hear voices and see light. Crawling to the edge, she peered down into a natural amphitheater carved out of the rock. Below her, 12 Taliban fighters were manning sniper positions that overlooked the canyon where the SEALs were trapped. They had perfect fields of fire into the canyon floor, and Sarah could see that they'd been systematically picking off the American forces. Several of the positions had high-powered rifles with telescopic sights, while others were armed with rocket-propelled grenades and machine guns. This was the position that had been causing the most casualties among the SEAL teams. Sarah studied the tactical situation, her mind racing despite the pain in her arm. The fighters were spread out across the chamber, taking advantage of natural rock formations for cover. Most of them were focused on the targets below and weren't expecting an attack from behind. But there were too many of them for her to take out with just a pistol, especially with only one good arm. That's when she noticed the ammunition stockpile. In the center of the chamber, the Taliban had assembled a massive cache of weapons and explosives. Rocket-propelled grenades, artillery shells, boxes of ammunition, and what looked like several improvised explosive devices. It was enough firepower to supply a small army, all stored in one convenient location. All of it highly explosive. Sarah smiled grimly and checked her remaining ammunition. She had 2 grenades on her survival vest and 4 magazines for her pistol. If she could create enough confusion and hit that ammunition stockpile, she might be able to take out the entire position. It would almost certainly be suicide, but it would also save the lives of the men trapped below. She thought about her brother Mike, somewhere in that canyon with the other SEALs. She thought about the oath she'd taken when she became an officer to defend the Constitution and protect those under her command. She thought about the 381 men who would die if she didn't act. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Sarah pulled the pin on her first grenade, counted to 3, and threw it into the chamber below. The grenade explosion in the cave chamber was like thunder trapped inside the mountain. The blast sent shock waves through the rock walls, bringing down chunks of stone and filling the air with choking dust. But, more importantly, it created exactly the chaos Sarah needed. Taliban fighters scattered in all directions, shouting in panic and confusion. Several were wounded by the shrapnel, while others dove for cover behind the rock formations. In the chaos, Sarah half fell, half jumped down into the chamber, her broken arm screaming in protest as she landed hard on the stone floor. The ammunition stockpile was 30 meters away, through a maze of panicked fighters and falling debris. Sarah sprinted toward it, her pistol in her good hand, firing at anyone who got in her way. The Taliban fighters, caught completely off guard by an attack from behind, were slow to respond effectively. She made it halfway to the ammunition cache before they started shooting back. Bullets sparked off the rock walls around her as Sarah dove behind a natural stone pillar. The chamber erupted into a firefight, with muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like a deadly light show. Sarah could hear at least 8 different weapons firing, from AK-47 rifles to heavy machine guns. But the Taliban fighters had a problem. In the confined space of the cave, they couldn't use their heavy weapons without risking bringing down the entire chamber. And the ricochets from the stone walls made every shot dangerous to friend and foe alike. Sarah used this to her advantage, moving from cover to cover and forcing the enemy fighters to expose themselves to get clear shots. Her pistol barked repeatedly as she picked off targets, each shot carefully aimed despite her injured arm and the chaotic conditions. A young Taliban fighter appeared around the edge of her cover, his rifle raised. Sarah put 2 rounds center mass before he could fire, dropping him where he stood. But as she moved to a new position, she felt a bullet crease her thigh, sending a line of fire across her leg. She was running out of ammunition, running out of time, and running out of luck. That's when she saw her chance. The leader of the Taliban fighters, an older man with a gray beard and expensive equipment, was directing the others from behind the ammunition stockpile. He was using a radio to coordinate with other positions throughout the cave system, probably calling for reinforcements. If Sarah could reach him, she could reach the explosives. She pulled the pin on her second and final grenade, cooked it for 2 seconds, and hurled it toward a group of fighters on the far side of the chamber. The explosion sent them diving for cover, giving her the opening she needed. Sarah broke from cover and ran directly toward the ammunition cache, firing her pistol until the slide locked back on an empty magazine. Taliban fighters emerged from behind rocks and opened fire, their bullets whipping through the air around her. 1 round punched through her survival vest, another shattered against her helmet. But she made it to the explosives. The Taliban leader turned to face her, his eyes wide with shock. He was reaching for his weapon when Sarah tackled him with her good shoulder, driving them both into the pile of artillery shells and rocket-propelled grenades. They rolled across the rocky floor, fighting for control of his rifle. Sarah might have been wounded and fighting with 1 arm, but she was also a trained combat pilot with 6 years of military experience. She drove her knee into the man's stomach, broke his grip on the rifle, and managed to get behind him with her good arm around his throat. "Call off your fighters," she shouted in broken Pashto. "Surrender now." The Taliban leader's response was to pull a knife from his belt and slash backward, the blade cutting across Sarah's wounded arm. She cried out in pain, but maintained her hold, even as blood soaked through her flight suit. Around them, the firefight was intensifying. More Taliban fighters were arriving from other parts of the cave system, and Sarah could hear boots pounding through the tunnels. Soon she'd be completely overwhelmed, but she was exactly where she needed to be. Still maintaining her chokehold on the Taliban leader, Sarah reached into her survival vest and pulled out a white phosphorus marking grenade. It was designed to create smoke for signaling rescue aircraft, but white phosphorus burned at 2,760 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to ignite anything it touched. Hot enough to set off an ammunition stockpile. "You want to die for your cause?" Sarah whispered in the man's ear. "So do I." She pulled the pin on the marking grenade and rolled it into the pile of explosives. The white phosphorus ignited immediately, sending streamers of burning chemical across the ammunition cache. Artillery shells began cooking off almost instantly, their explosions feeding back into the larger stockpile. Within seconds, the entire ammunition dump was engulfed in a chain reaction of explosions that shook the entire mountain. Sarah released the Taliban leader and threw herself behind the largest rock she could find, curling into a ball as the cave chamber erupted around her. The explosions went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, each detonation triggering more secondary explosions as the ammunition cooked off. When the blast finally stopped, Sarah found herself buried under a pile of rubble in complete darkness. The air was thick with dust and smoke, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Her ears were ringing so loudly she couldn't hear anything else, and every part of her body felt like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. But she was alive. More importantly, the sniper position had been completely eliminated. The explosions had brought down most of the cave system, crushing or burying anyone who hadn't been killed outright by the blasts. The Taliban fighters who had been systematically picking off the SEAL teams were gone. It took Sarah almost an hour to dig herself out of the rubble, using her one good arm to move rocks and debris. By the time she crawled back to the cave entrance, the sun was breaking through the storm clouds for the first time all day. The weather was finally starting to clear. Below in the canyon, she could see the SEAL teams moving more freely now that the sniper fire had stopped. Orange smoke was rising from several positions as they marked landing zones for extraction helicopters. In the distance, she could hear the distinctive sound of rotary aircraft approaching. Help was finally coming. Sarah managed to make it down to the canyon floor just as the first Black Hawk helicopter settled into the makeshift landing zone. SEAL medics immediately surrounded her, checking her injuries and preparing to load her onto the aircraft. But she waved them off, insisting that the more seriously wounded be evacuated first. "Ma'am, you need immediate medical attention," one of the medics insisted. "That arm is definitely broken, and you've lost a lot of blood." "I'm fine," Sarah replied through gritted teeth. "Take care of your people first." That's when a familiar face appeared through the crowd of SEALs. Her brother Mike, his face streaked with dirt and blood, but very much alive. He took one look at her condition, and his eyes filled with tears. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing here? Someone had to come get you idiots," she managed to say before collapsing for blood loss and exhaustion. When she woke up, she was in the base hospital at Bagram, her left arm in a cast, and her body covered with bandages. Colonel Hartwell was sitting beside her bed, his expression unreadable. "Captain Martinez," he said quietly, "we need to talk." Sarah's heart sank. She knew what was coming. Court-martial proceedings for disobeying direct orders. The end of her flying career. Possibly prison time. "Sir, I know I disobeyed orders. I know I violated standing protocols. But I couldn't just sit there and let those men die." Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Captain, you saved the lives of 381 Navy SEALs. You single-handedly eliminated multiple enemy positions and cleared the way for a successful extraction. What you did was either the most heroic or the most foolish thing I've seen in 30 years of military service." "Probably both, sir. Probably both," he agreed, which is why this conversation never happened. "As far as the official record is concerned, you were conducting a routine maintenance flight when you encountered the emergency situation. Everything you did after that falls under the Good Samaritan provisions of military law." Sarah stared at him in shock. "Sir, Captain, the Navy wants to give you the Distinguished Flying Cross. The Air Force wants to give you the Silver Star. And the SEALs want to make you an honorary member of their brotherhood. I'm not about to stand in the way of any of that by filing paperwork about violated protocols. But, sir, I disobeyed direct orders." Hartwell leaned forward in his chair. "Captain Martinez, leadership isn't about following orders blindly. It's about making the right decision when the right decision is hard. You made the right decision. The fact that it violated some regulations is irrelevant." Over the next few days, word of Sarah's actions spread throughout the military community. The story of the female A-10 pilot who flew into impossible weather conditions to save 381 trapped SEALs became legend. She received visits from generals, admirals, and senior enlisted personnel from all branches of the service. But the visit that meant the most came from the families of the men she'd saved. They came by the dozens, wives and children and parents of the SEAL team members who had been trapped in that canyon. They brought flowers and cards and home-baked cookies. They told her stories about their loved ones, showed her pictures, and thanked her over and over for bringing their families home. One woman the wife of a SEAL named Rodriguez, brought her 6-year-old daughter. The little girl shyly approached Sarah's hospital bed and handed her a drawing she'd made. It showed a stick-figure airplane flying through clouds, with "Thank you for saving my daddy" written in crayon across the top. That's when Sarah finally broke down and cried. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood on the reviewing stand at Nellis Air Force Base, her left arm still slightly stiff from the injuries she'd sustained in Afghanistan. The desert sun beat down on the assembled crowd of military personnel, family members, and media representatives who had gathered for the ceremony. She was wearing her dress blues, the same uniform she'd worn at her commissioning ceremony 8 years earlier. But now the chest was decorated with ribbons that told the story of her service. The Distinguished Flying Cross sat prominently among them, along with the Purple Heart, the Air Medal with Combat Device, and the Afghanistan Campaign Medal. But it wasn't the decorations that made her different now. It was the way people looked at her. Air Force Chief of Staff General Patricia Williams stepped up to the podium, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to honor an officer whose actions embody the very best of our Air Force core values. Integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do." Sarah's mind drifted back to that stormy morning in Afghanistan. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet the memories were still vivid. The sound of the A-10's cannon, the feeling of the aircraft shaking apart around her, the faces of the Taliban fighters in the cave. The moment she realized she might not survive. Captain Sarah Martinez demonstrated exceptional courage under fire when she defied weather conditions that had grounded all other aircraft and flew a solo mission to rescue 381 trapped Navy SEALs. Her actions that day saved lives and exemplified the warrior ethos that defines our military. The ceremony was beautiful and moving, but Sarah found herself thinking about the cost of that day. Not just her own injuries, which had healed, but the broader implications of what she'd done. The media attention had been overwhelming. News crews from around the world had descended on Bagram Air Base, all wanting to interview the angel of Afghanistan. The story had captured the public imagination in a way that military officials hadn't expected. A female pilot defying orders to save trapped soldiers was the kind of story that transcended politics and touched something fundamental about heroism and sacrifice. But with the attention came scrutiny. Military investigators had looked into every detail of her actions that day, questioning whether she'd really been conducting a maintenance flight or if she'd deliberately disobeyed orders. The investigation had eventually been closed without charges, partly because the results spoke for themselves, but also because prosecuting someone who'd saved 381 lives would have been a public relations nightmare. The actions of Captain Martinez remind us that heroism isn't about following a script. It's about making the right choice when the stakes are highest and the odds are longest. Sarah looked out at the crowd and saw faces she recognized. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was there, along with Airman Johnson, both of whom had been quietly decorated for their role in preparing her aircraft that night. Colonel Hartwell sat in the front row, his retirement ceremony scheduled for the following month. He'd told her privately that her actions had restored his faith in the next generation of military leaders. Near the back, she could see some of the SEAL team members who had been in that canyon. They'd formed an unofficial organization called the 381 Club and stayed in touch with each other and with her. Every year on the anniversary of the rescue, they held a reunion and invited her to attend. She'd gone to every one, treasuring the bonds formed in those desperate hours in the Afghan mountains. Today, Captain Martinez is being promoted to Major and will be taking command of the 74th Fighter Squadron at Moody Air Force Base. She will be the youngest officer and the first woman to hold this command. The promotion was both an honor and a challenge. The 74th Fighter Squadron flew A-10 aircraft, the same jet Sarah had used in Afghanistan. She would be responsible for training the next generation of pilots, teaching them not just the technical skills needed to fly combat missions, but the judgment required to make life and death decisions under pressure. As General Williams pinned the Major's oak leaves on her shoulders, Sarah thought about the responsibility that came with leadership. The young pilots under her command would look to her as an example, would judge their own actions against the standard she had set. It was both humbling and terrifying. "Major Martinez, do you have anything you'd like to say?" Sarah stepped up to the podium and looked out at the assembled crowd. Her brother Mike was there with his wife and children, beaming with pride. Her parents had flown in from Texas, along with dozens of other family members and friends. Master Sergeant Rodriguez's wife had brought their 2 sons, both of whom were planning military careers inspired by the events in Afghanistan. Thank you, General Williams, and thank you all for being here today. When I flew into that storm 6 months ago, I wasn't thinking about heroism or medals or ceremonies like this. I was thinking about the men who were trapped and running out of time. I was thinking about doing my job. She paused, gathering her thoughts. People have called what I did heroic, but I disagree. Heroism is what those 381 SEALs did every day in Afghanistan, putting themselves in harm's way to protect innocent people and fight terrorism. Heroism is what my maintenance crew did when they helped me prepare that aircraft, knowing they were risking their own careers. Heroism is what every service member does when they take an oath to defend something bigger than themselves. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. What I did was make a choice. When faced with rules that conflicted with my values, I chose to follow my conscience. When faced with personal risk that conflicted with my duty to others, I chose duty. I hope that if any of you ever face a similar choice, you'll have the courage to do what's right, even when it's hard. The applause that followed was thunderous, lasting several minutes as the crowd rose to their feet. But Sarah was already thinking ahead to the challenges that lay before her as a squadron commander. 2 weeks later, she stood in the briefing room at Moody Air Force Base, addressing her new squadron for the first time. 24 pilots sat before her, a mix of experienced combat veterans and newly minted lieutenants fresh for pilot training. They were watching her carefully, trying to gauge what kind of leader she would be. My name is Major Sarah Martinez, and I'm your new squadron commander. Some of you probably know my story, and some of you probably have opinions about what happened in Afghanistan. Here's what I want you to know about how I intend to run this squadron. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, which showed a photo of an A-10 in flight. Our mission is to provide close air support to ground forces in contact with the enemy. Everything we do, every training flight we fly, every procedure we practice is designed to make us better at that mission. Because when we get the call, there will be soldiers, Marines, or SEALs on the ground who are counting on us to keep them alive. The room was completely silent. I will never ask you to do anything I wouldn't do myself. I will never send you into danger without doing everything possible to ensure you're prepared and equipped for success. And I will never abandon you when things get difficult. Sarah clicked to the next slide, which showed the squadron motto. Our motto is ready to fight. That means ready to make hard decisions under pressure, ready to risk your life for others, ready to do your job, even when the conditions are impossible. If you're not ready for that level of commitment, this isn't the squadron for you. Over the following months, Sarah threw herself into building the squadron into the most effective close air support unit in the Air Force. She instituted new training programs that emphasized decision-making under pressure and ethical leadership. She worked with ground units to develop better coordination procedures and communication protocols. Most importantly, she created a culture where asking questions was encouraged and blind obedience was discouraged. Her pilots were trained to think critically, to challenge assumptions, and to make decisions based on the situation at hand rather than rigid adherence to protocol. The results were impressive. Within a year, the 74th Fighter Squadron had the highest mission readiness rate in their wing and had been selected to participate in several high-profile joint training exercises. But more than that, they had developed a reputation for innovation and creative problem-solving that attracted attention from senior Air Force leadership. Sarah's approach wasn't without controversy. Some senior officers felt that her emphasis on individual initiative and questioning authority was undermining military discipline. There were whispers that she was training cowboys rather than disciplined airmen. But the critics were silenced when the squadron was deployed to Syria as part of the campaign against ISIS. The deployment lasted 6 months and involved some of the most challenging close air support missions flown since the beginning of the War on Terror. ISIS fighters were skilled at using human shields and hiding among civilian populations, making precision strikes extremely difficult. The rules of engagement were complex and constantly changing, requiring pilots to make split-second decisions about when and where to engage. Sarah's pilots excelled in these conditions. Their training in critical thinking and ethical decision-making proved invaluable when faced with ambiguous situations and competing priorities. They flew 847 combat sorties without a single friendly fire incident or civilian casualty, a record that was unprecedented in modern warfare. The deployment also provided Sarah with her own opportunity to prove that Afghanistan hadn't been a fluke. When a special operations team was pinned down by ISIS fighters in a bombed-out building in Mosul, Sarah led a flight of 4 A-10s in a precision strike that eliminated the enemy positions without harming any civilians sheltering in nearby buildings. It was exactly the kind of mission that had made her famous, but this time she was operating with full authorization and support from her chain of command. The strike was textbook perfect, demonstrating that her actions in Afghanistan had been the result of skill and judgment, not luck. When a squadron returned from Syria, they were greeted as heroes. The unit received the Air Force Outstanding Unit Award, and several individual pilots were decorated for their actions in combat. Sarah herself was promoted to lieutenant colonel and selected to attend the Air War College, a clear sign that she was being groomed for senior leadership positions. But the real measure of her success came in a different form. 3 of her pilots were selected for promotion to major ahead of their peers. 2 were chosen for command positions in other squadrons. 1 was selected to attend Test Pilot School, one of the most competitive programs in the Air Force. All of them credited their success to the leadership and training they had received in the 74th Fighter Squadron. More importantly, they had internalized the lessons Sarah had tried to teach them about moral courage and ethical leadership. When faced with their own difficult decisions and later assignments, they consistently chose to do the right thing, even when it was hard. On her last day as squadron commander, before departing for the Air War College, Sarah stood once again in the briefing room where she had first addressed her pilots. This time she was saying goodbye. "When I took command of this squadron, I told you that our mission was to provide close air support to ground forces in contact with the enemy. That's still true. But I hope I've also taught you that our broader mission is to serve something bigger than ourselves." She looked around the room at faces that had become familiar over 2 years of training, deployment, and shared challenges. You'll all go on to other assignments, other responsibilities. Some of you will become squadron commanders yourself someday. When that happens, I want you to remember what we built here. I want you to remember that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about having the courage to ask the right questions and the wisdom to make difficult choices. The applause that followed was warm and heartfelt, but Sarah could see tears in several eyes. These pilots had become more than subordinates. They had become a family, bound together by shared purpose and mutual respect. As Sarah packed up her office later that day, she found the drawing that Rodriguez's daughter had given her in the hospital in Afghanistan. The stick-figure airplane flying through clouds, with "Thank you for saving my daddy" written in crayon across the top. She had kept it on her desk throughout her command, a reminder of why she did what she did. 10 years had passed since that stormy morning in Afghanistan. Sarah was now a full colonel, serving as the deputy commander of Air Combat Command. She had been selected for promotion to brigadier general, which would make her one of the youngest general officers in Air Force history. But more than the promotions and the decorations, what she was proudest of was the legacy she had built. The pilots she had trained were now serving in leadership positions throughout the Air Force, carrying forward the lessons they had learned about moral courage and ethical decision-making. The 381 Club still held their annual reunions, and Sarah still attended every one. The bond forged in that Afghan canyon had proven unbreakable, transcending rank and branch of service. Many of the SEALs had retired from the military and gone on to successful civilian careers, but they never forgot the pilot who had risked everything to save their lives. Her brother Mike had become a command master chief, the senior enlisted advisor to a 3-star admiral. He often told the story of his sister's heroism to young sailors, using it as an example of what it meant to serve others before yourself. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had retired after 30 years of service and was now working as a civilian contractor, training the next generation of aircraft maintainers. He kept a photo in his office of the crew that had prepared Desert Angel that night, a reminder that heroism comes in many forms. Colonel Hartwell had passed away 5 years earlier, but not before writing a letter recommending Sarah for promotion to general. In it, he had written, "Colonel Martinez represents the very best of our Air Force. She has the courage to do what's right, the wisdom to make difficult decisions, and the leadership skills to inspire others to excellence. She will serve our nation with distinction at any level of responsibility." As Sarah sat in her office at Langley Air Force Base, reviewing budget reports and personnel files, she sometimes wondered what would have happened if she had made a different choice that night in Afghanistan. If she had followed orders and stayed on the ground while 381 men died in a canyon halfway around the world. But she always came to the same conclusion. She would make the same choice again, knowing the cost and accepting the consequences. Because some things are worth more than careers or regulations or personal safety. Some things are worth everything. The phone on her desk rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was the Chief of Staff's office calling to schedule a meeting about her upcoming promotion ceremony. In 3 months, she would pin on her first star and become Brigadier General Sarah Martinez, the youngest female general in the Air Force. But as she answered the phone, Sarah wasn't thinking about the ceremony or the additional responsibilities that would come with her new rank. She was thinking about a group of young pilots who would soon be under her influence and how she could help them develop the courage to make the right choices when the stakes were highest. Because that's what leadership was really about. Not the rank or the authority, but the opportunity to shape the next generation of warriors. To teach them that rules and regulations have their place, but that sometimes conscience and compassion matter more. To help them understand that real heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's about a female A-10 pilot who flew into the storm when everyone else stayed home and changed the course of history with her courage.